Hey there, and welcome to Daniel's podcast. Today, we're jumping headfirst into Rebellion Festival, one of the biggest, loudest, and proudest punk festivals on the planet. Never been? Not sure what it's all about? Don't worry, this episode's your backstage pass to the whole thing. Quick shout out before we dive in. I want to apologise to Nial McGuirk and Herman de Tollenare. We did record interviews, but sadly, the audio quality was just too rough to include. Hopefully next time. Now, get ready to meet my fantastic guest, Michael Murphy, who's got the inside scoop on everything Rebellion, the bands, the buzz, the atmosphere, and why it's such a magnetic gathering for punks from all walks of life. So, what did we talk about? First, I wanted to know who's going to Rebellion, what bands are playing, what actually happens across those 3 or 4 intense days of music and mayhem.
I went to Rebellion this year in 2024, and I honestly can't remember when I first went, but I believe it's 12 years ago. And, I was aware of it, and I would look at the lineup and I would think, thank God I never have to go to that festival. Like, thank God that's in Blackpool, because who would go to that? And at the very, very far end of the spectrum of people who would never go to that are people like me, because I don't live in the past. I don't have a whole load of time for nostalgia. I'm curious. I'm a historian kind of by mental attitude, but I don't feel a huge need to revisit the past. So I never, ever thought I would go. And when I did go, I just went for a day because my friend Nial McGuirk, who's, a leading light in the DIY movement in Dublin and that punk rock movement. But he was going, I thought, I'll go, but I'm only going for a day. And I'm kind of it was like when I went to see Neil Young in the 1980s. I was only going because I thought, this is an old person who won't be around for much longer. And I'll be able to say I saw them. So I really was going to the punk festival just kind of out of curiosity. I wasn't going out of passion. And then I went, and it was so cool, Danielle. Like, it was such an amazing experience. Because I always thought, if you're going to be around 6 to 10,000 punks, there's going to be a bit of an edge. I grew up seeing, I don't want to say I grew up in the Dublin punk scene, but I was very, very close observer to it. But it was a scene you wouldn't want to be in because it was so dangerous. It was so aggressive. It was so hostile. It was so mean-spirited. There were loads of individually good people, but things were always on a knife edge in the Dublin punk scene. So, I love the music. I'm fascinated by the people. I'm interested in the culture. But it wasn't my top of my list of things to do. But when I went, it was a revelation because it was so calm. It was so peaceful. It was full of really interesting people. And, I've gone back pretty much every year since. And it's a complete highlight. This year, it's spread over 4 days. So it's a Thursday, a Friday, a Saturday, and a Sunday. And normally the Thursday is the quiet day, the slow day, where people are just arriving for their weekend. But this year, when I got off the train, it was around just after lunch on the Thursday, and I noticed that Blackpool was packed, full of punks on the Thursday. So it's growing, and it was completely sold out. Like, you couldn't buy a weekend ticket, and you couldn't buy individual day tickets. So it's a festival that has grown. Who goes to it? Punks from all over the world. Punks, people who look like punks. Now, maybe they don't look like punks all the time. Maybe they probably, some of them work in banks. I know for a fact some of them are incredibly successful, and some of them are people who it's probably a very big expenditure, a big budget item. So it's a real meeting of the tribes because it's people who are interested in subculture. There are younger people they're older people. So they're, when I say older people, I mean people in their late 60s into their 70s who must have been around for that first rush of punk bands, 1976 and all. It's global. There's loads of Americans, loads of Scottish. You hear a lot of Scottish accents, which could be because it's close. Blackpool is close to Scotland, or that punk subculture really embedded itself in certain countries. You get a lot of Eastern European punks, a lot of Brazilian punks, punks from everywhere. So it's fascinating. If you don't like punk, but if you're interested in fashion, if you're interested in youth culture, if you're interested in sociology, I couldn't recommend it enough because it's just fascinating to be in a world. And I don't want to compare it to cosplay, but that is growing. It's people who are really celebrating some aspect of their personality. And often it's an aspect of their personality that they've been nurturing and holding in their hearts 40 plus years. And then there are younger people and think, well, you weren't there in 1977 because you weren't even born. You weren't even born in the year 2000. But, it clearly means a lot to them. So it's from a people point of view, watching, observing, thinking, what kind of records did they buy? What back patches, what T-shirts? It's such a dream.
Then we looked at Ireland's presence at the festival. Who's representing and how's the scene over there getting involved?
Ireland's really, really well represented. Paranoid Visions, who had, a really good flair of energy when they began in kind of the early mid-80s, as I call it. So early mid-80s, they were a very, very important force because they lasted. The Irish punk scene, everyone who was interested in punk knows about the Northern Irish punk scene. And punk was very effectively suppressed for various reasons in the South, in the Republic of Ireland. And then Paranoid Visions came along and they were scrappy at a time where the punk bands generally didn't record an album, certainly. Very rare that an Irish punk band recorded a single. And at most, they might have recorded a demo tape, and sometimes they came out on cassettes. So there's a real gap in terms of archive material from that early burst of punk in the South, which happened later than punk in Northern Ireland. And I remember Bill Graham, the great writer in Hot Press, writing that the South had only produced one single in 10 years. There was only one punk single. And I think you could argue that the Virgin Prunes were punk, but they really were post-punk and they were more performance-based, although they were musically brilliant, in my opinion. But Bill Graham thought that the Threat, a band called the Threat that Stano was part of, that they released the only punk single. And that says something. So the Irish contingent is huge because Paranoid Visions refused to give up. They had this dogged determination, and they didn't just become important in terms of documenting what was going on in Irish life from a punk point of view. They started bringing punk bands from elsewhere over to Ireland. They maintained the scene. They built up a network, mainly through their guitarist, Peter Jones, and they're now a really, really important, a vital part of what I would see as the Rebellion family or the Rebellion tribe. So a lot of the bands associated with Paranoid Visions in some way, like Meryl Streep, like the Vulpines, like the Nials, like the Lee Harveys, like the GAC, are front and center and are building audiences. Like, it's amazing to see Irish punk bands playing in England, and there's people from all over the world enjoying them and going to see them, because there's generally a choice at the festival. There are 6 stages going on at the same time, so you have to make a decision not to see 5 bands, to go and see the band that's playing
Yeah.
at that particular time.
I also wanted to hear how Rebellion compares to other rock festivals. What sets it apart?
There's a trend in America. I've done a bit of research on festivals, and the trend in the States, and I think without having done the research, this is happening in Europe. More music festivals are taking place in cities. So they're not out in a field. No offense to Electric Picnic. But they're in city centres, which has the advantage, and Rebellion, one of the great things about it is you get your ticket or your wristband and you can leave to go to Marks and Spencer for a sandwich, or to get a bag of chips, or to go for a walk on the seafront, or to go to a football match, or to get on the train and go to Preston or Manchester to go record shopping, having seen a band at Rebellion, and then you come back in the evening. So there's something entirely different about the character of a music festival in a city centre. And I think that's really important for Rebellion. It makes it a completely different experience. So I find that really interesting. Here, to put in context, this year it was announced that there was going to be an EDL march, which was taking place a couple of yards away from the punk festival. So suddenly the neutrality, it's a very neutral festival because there's no display of political material, because there are punks probably with various different philosophies at this, and you don't want things to kick off. So it's almost like a truce is declared. But this year was a little bit different because of that undercurrent of what's going to happen, and in fact, what's happening in Britain from a political point of view and from a social unrest point of view. And it's fascinating to see that from a punk lens, that suddenly the punks are the well-behaved citizens, that the police aren't looking, oh, there's a punk walking down the street. It's, oh, okay, that's just one of the punks.
Of course, I had to ask about the highlights of 2024 and what Michael thinks will be the unmissable moments of 2025.
How long do you have for me to list the highlights of 2024? And keep in mind that I'm the reluctant Rebellion festival goer. I was originally very skeptical. But for me, and the absolute highlight this year is the literary stage. I find it fascinating to hear the stories. Like, there are people talking, and I bought their records. And here they are. So there were a couple of highlights. There's a brilliant woman called Dr. Helen Reddington. But to me, she's Helen McCookery book from the chefs. And she hosted 2 of the best punk conversations that I've seen. And I've been studying and enjoying punk, for almost 50 years. And she interviewed Pam Olive from the Slits. And I also thought, okay, they had a drummer called Pam Olive, which is a funny name. And I probably knew somewhere that she was from Spain. But to hear an eyewitness account from a woman speaking about growing up in Franco Spain, growing up in a very large family, growing up expecting that all life held for her was getting married and kind of making the life of her husband very, very good, kind of seeing that as her main role in society, and that the squatting community of which people like Joe Strummer were part of, to see how important, what a sense of freedom England and London, and in this case the Scots in particular, represented, was fascinating. But then you also have to think, okay, so she's gone out with Joe Strummer before he's in the Clash, and she's not from England or Ireland. She's from continental Europe. So suddenly, she's exotic in a place that she's come to because she feels that that's exotic. So that was a fascinating story about how the communal living, the self-support of the squatting movement. And she noticed that it was very, very open. It was free from rules. until the women started doing things that expressed their freedom. And then the men suddenly said, hey, you can't really do that. And so the double standard was exposed. And then she got a bit bored of that. But that was absolutely fascinating. And then hear about her history with the slits, with the, she brilliantly, and you never think of this. I don't. She said she used to really have so many really, really angry arguments with Ari up from the slits. And she said, but that was no problem because I grew up with a really big family. So we always had those big family fights. So, what other people would have thought, oh my God, that band is going to break up because they're always at each other's throats. It was part of her family relationship. So I could go on, like I could speak to you about what I learned from that speech for the 20 minutes that she spoke. So that was an absolute highlight. Pauline Murray from Penetration, again, Helen Reddington did the interview and she just handled it so brilliantly. Another thing I learned is that the person interviewing the person really, really makes a huge difference. And Helen Reddington just got the best. And Pauline Murray just talked about how Penetration were squeezed dry by their managers. And she's just written about this in her autobiography, that these managers just thought, punk, we don't really care about it, but it seems to be selling records. So let's just send these young people out, put them up in bad accommodation, tour them until they drop, with all the tensions, all of the excitement, but also the drama and the boredom that comes with that. So I learned so much from that. Laura Logic, I have the Essential Logic 7-inch singles, but to hear this story of this young person who was a Finnish extract. So punk isn't British, punk isn't American, it's not Anglo-American. There were all of these subtle influences, but I think they were really, really important. And hearing women talk, like I just realized almost everything I know about punk and almost everything I've read about punk in books, and brilliant books, it's lads talking. So that was a complete highlight for me. Dale Vinspo, who used to be someone who went around in an old van, like bands like the Levelers, like Culture Shock, the Battle of the Beanfield. He was there where the British police decided we're not having any more of these, they were seen as kind of modern day crusties or hippies. And then he went on and founded one of the biggest and most successful global enterprises in green energy. And hearing him speak was really, really interesting. And he said, there are two ways to change things. And one is DIY, one is do it yourself, and the other is being a catalyst. And that really made me, because I'm at a punk festival, I'm someone who loves punk music. So I applied that to punk, and I thought that's a really interesting way to see. And then another fascinating talk was by a guy called Rodent. And I knew the name Rodent because I heard that he was a roadie for the Sex Pistols and then a roadie from the Clash. And you think, okay, he's probably some guy, maybe he works in a supermarket now, and he says, oh yeah, I used to be a roadie for these punk bands. But he's had an incredible life since, and he was in Zimbabwe traveling with Bob Marley for Zimbabwe's independence. So these people who kind of got a prompt from that punk moment to do something, or to trace maybe the beginning of their creativity or their self-expression or their career path to that. So I find those stories brilliant. And then there's a guy called Sean from a band, an oi band called Hard Skin. And he did a talk that was just so ridiculous. And the interviewer just couldn't handle it because it was a complete parody. He's in his Hard Skin are this incredible oi band who are also brilliant satirists of the whole punk scene and the oi scene and the skinhead scene. and the wider cultural scene around those movements. And it was just this incredible moment where someone was in character, being incredibly funny, and the interviewer just didn't know how to deal with it. And it was very, very funny, but then it had another layer of humor because of this mismatch between them. So I could talk about the music for an hour or two, but I just found the talk so compelling, so interesting. Michelle from the band Brigandage, who I didn't have their records, but I knew about them, and they were part of that what was labeled the positive punk movement with the Sex Gang Children after the New Romantics. And it turns out that she was one of the Bromley contingent. So she was going to see Susie and the Banshees and the Sex Pistols, and I only know her from, okay, so she came along when it was kind of cool to be punk in that kind of goth punk crossover. But these people were there at the very, very start and aren't included in the history.
And finally, we went deep. Is punk now more about nostalgia? Has it lost its raw innocence? Or is it still a living, breathing force? And most importantly, why should I or anyone go to Rebellion this year?
I don't think anyone should go to Rebellion next year. Like, honestly, I don't want to sell it to people because there'll be more room for me to walk around if other people don't go. It gets packed. So if you want to see a band, like especially any of the big bands, but some of the big bands are quite new to me. So there's a band called the Barstool Preachers. They've got a great line. To me, they're a new band because they weren't there in 1977 or in the 80s. They probably weren't even around in the 90s. But they wouldn't be recognizable as a punk band to me. I wouldn't categorize them as a punk band, but they're absolutely part of this movement because they're stretching what punk means. And, they've got a great line that you should never look down on anyone unless you're reaching your hand to help them up. And to me, that seems to be a philosophy of punk. The other thing that I saw a band, and it made me realize, Danielle, when was the last band from Slovakia? I've gone to over 5,000 gigs, but I don't think I've ever seen a Slovakian band. And I saw Clockwork Psycho, who had a girl singer who plays the double bass. They're a psychobilly band, and they did a song, a Ukrainian folk song. And I just thought, this world is big. This punk subculture, the subculture, sub is really, really small because it's a huge, huge culture, and people dip in and out of it. They change it when they become part of it. But yeah, a band, there's new bands like the Meffs, there's new bands like the Vulpines from Ireland, like Meryl Streep, and they're not punk in the classical sense. So the really exciting thing about this is that punk keeps on changing. And for me, it's a highlight to see the Ruts because I loved them when I was a schoolboy. It's a highlight to see TV Smith because I loved them when I was a schoolboy, and they're still great. It's a highlight to see Tom Robinson Band because I loved them when I was a schoolboy, and I still do. And I'd never seen them before. So there's a mixture of the old and the new. But if people are going next year, look at the lineup. And if there's a big band that you want to see, you have to go into the hall to see the band before them because it gets packed. Like this subculture is not going away. It's growing. It should be shrinking. Demographically, it should be shrinking because the people who were there at the original time of punk are getting older. They're dying. It's just the way things happen. But there's a whole new, and it's not a generation because it's little clusters of individuals who find this scene incredibly interesting and compelling. But they're not just passively watching it, they're completely actively constructing a new world of punk. And that's thrilling to see.
Michael wrapped it all up perfectly. So now the question is, are you going to Rebellion this year?